empathy during invasion, pacifism during wartime, progressivism during totalitarianism. Are these ideals worth striving for in unfortunate circumstances, or contradictions that are impossible to reconcile? No one understands this humanistic and moralistic quandary better than Masake Kobayashi, a man who turned to the medium of filmmaking in the first place in search of an outlet to voice his disdain for his own country's actions in the invasion of China and Manchuria and its role in World War II. Kobayashi wasn't reflectively looking back after the fact. He was there at the time in the thick of it. These were ongoing atrocities, and he had a pressing, urgent need to send a message. He began learning filmcraft to get this message out, but in a perfectly ironic twist of fate, Kobayashi was forcibly conscripted into the very military he was criticizing before he was able to voice his anti-war concerns through the medium. Opposed to the system he was forced into on a fundamental level, he refused to take part in the military machine. He had the nerve and the resolve to protest from within, to the extent that he became a prisoner of war in his own country and remained in confinement on Japanese soil until a year after the war was over. His first film to tackle the subject was The Thick-Walled Room. While it works well as a film in isolation and feels quite different in context, and is absolutely worth watching on its own, the themes and subject matter are similar enough to the human condition that The Thick-Walled Room nearly feels like a rough draft for that later Gesamtkunstwerk. There are even a couple of scenes shared between the two that are practically mirrors of each other. The Thick-Walled Room was made in 1953, but wasn't allowed to see the light of day for years due to its critical portrayal of the Japanese military and government, which he depicted as refusing to accept proper accountability while passing the blame off to the grunts at the bottom of the totem pole. And he delivered the scathing indictment while simultaneously vocally pushing pacifist, communist, and socialist ideals, even having a character preach that the workers of the world need to unite as comrades. This progressive and transgressive vein of Kobayashi's work reached its zenith with The Human Condition. Adapted from 6 novels while also gaining a personal spin from Kobayashi's lived experiences, this 6-part film series, which is usually divided into a trilogy of 2-parters, clocks in at a staggering 9.5 hours long. But don't let its daunting length put you off. This is Essential Cinema. If this is your first time watching, welcome to Brickwall Pictures and welcome to my Essential Cinema series, where I highlight films that I consider to be some of the best ever made and attempt to break down precisely why they're so great and why I consider them essential viewing for cinephiles and or aspiring filmmakers. All 3 volumes of The Human Condition follow Kaji, who is played to perfection by the always excellent Tetsuya Nakadai. Kobayashi and Nakadai had already worked together a couple of times on films like Black River and the aforementioned The Thick-Walled Room, and they would continue working together after the trilogy was complete on projects like the masterpiece that is Hara-Kiri and more. I won't spoil where he ends up, but Kaji begins the trilogy as an idealistic and potentially naive young man who is morally opposed to the ongoing affronts of World War II and is a pacifist by nature. Unable to avoid the war entirely, he manages to dodge the responsibilities of a foot soldier by taking on a more bureaucratic role as a supervisor for a mining camp, which is turned into a prison labor camp where Chinese POWs are worked mercilessly. Sticking to his ideals, Kaji attempts to improve conditions for the POWs while pushing socialist ideals on the labor camp, while his superiors are outraged by his humanity towards the enemy. This core conflict is what sets the trilogy in motion, but the plot is more far-reaching than I'll get into here. I'll leave it for you to discover for yourself. From his idealistic starting point, Kaji embarks on what is quite possibly the single greatest long-form character arc in the history of cinema. Sure, that's quite a hyperbolic statement, but I did just rank The Human Condition in the #1 spot on my list of the top 250 greatest films ever made. Check that video out to see what else made the cut. And you can also visit the Brickwall Pictures Patreon to see a patron-exclusive bonus video that covers a bunch of runners-up to that list. In US schools, for whatever reason, we aren't typically taught anywhere near as much about Japan's actions in World War II as we are about the Germans. The date that we're told World War II began is even disputed, with Americans often being taught that it began in 1939, which is also the date you'll find in most history books or with the Google search. But sources throughout China and other parts of Asia instead identify the Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937 as the official start of the war. Japan had invaded Manchuria 6 years prior, and the Marco Polo Bridge incident can be pinpointed as containing the first gunshots fired in what would become World War II. Estimates vary wildly from source to source, but anywhere from 8 million to 20 million Chinese and Manchurian people were killed by the Japanese military, and the bulk of them were civilians. I mention all of this context because these are the people imprisoned in Kaji's labor camp. They might be considered prisoners of war, but that doesn't mean they were enemy soldiers captured in battle. The majority of them were defenseless civilians uprooted and forced into de facto slavery for manual labor, similar to how Kaji himself was uprooted and forced into working for his warmongering country, but obviously magnified in severity many times over. Circling back to the question posed at the beginning, empathy during wartime, pacifism during totalitarianism. Are these ideals worth striving for, or contradictions that are impossible to reconcile? In Kaji's case, he wants so badly for it to be the former, but he learns the hard way that it's the latter. It doesn't matter that his heart is in the right place and that he respects the POWs more than all of his superiors do. At the end of the day, he's still a wretch to those he keeps imprisoned, and still a cog in a machine that produces nothing but suffering. Good intentions are worthless as long as you abide by evil. It's only by making a stand and a sacrifice that Kaji's morals are truly upheld, and under totalitarianism, doing what's right comes with a heavy cost. This heavy cost is the crux of the Human Condition trilogy, and Kaji spends most of the runtime paying it. At over 9.5 hours long, it can be a challenging watch, both for the runtime itself and for its grueling commitment to showing the extent to which human cruelty can be justified and condoned. You might look at that runtime and judge it on face value as excessive, but it really isn't when judged in context. Every moment matters. There's no filler here, with the exception of a handful of repeated scenes used to recap the plot between the first volumes. Each entry in the trilogy builds to crescendos that rely on the slower, quieter moments that came between to give them their power. In this way, and with their brilliant structure, each of the trilogy's 3 installments feel like complete and compelling films on their own, while also being inextricably linked to each other, as every moment that transpires build on every moment that came before in integral ways. For an example of the hefty runtime being put to good use, the execution and rallying scene that serves as the culmination of Kaji's character arc for the first installment wouldn't land with anywhere near the same degree of resonance if it wasn't preceded by 3 hours of meticulous lead-up as Kaji's character undergoes his internal struggle and tensions slowly build to a boiling point within the prison camp. This scene is unendingly powerful. At great cost to his own safety and well-being, Kaji manages to save these prisoners facing needless, motiveless execution. It nearly costs him his own life, but he succeeds. At least in the moment. He may just be prolonging the inevitable, but at least he did something, instead of choosing inaction while the machine he's a part of went about its business. But even with this grand sacrifice and minor success, Kaji can take little solace because he has already let others die. Whatever good he's done by standing up to the powers that be, he already stood by and watched as other prisoners were executed in brutal, inhumane fashion. He knows that he could have acted sooner and could have done more. Kaji is a part of the war, but he isn't fighting the same war as everyone else around him. Instead, he's at war with his own side, his own military. He's not a deserter, nor does he remain a conscientious objector. He's a dissenter. And again, defying the rule he's placed under comes with a heavy cost to him in a physical and material sense, to his family and to his humanity. In the second volume, he's transferred from his prison labor camp job into service amongst the Japanese soldiers. Though the supervisor position tormented him morally and ethically, it's downright cushy compared to what he's put through in each of the escalating volumes. In a brilliant inversion, interior and exterior locations are swapped against expectations. The first installment takes place almost entirely in the POW camp, where the majority of action takes place outside, with beautiful vistas in all directions. The second installment follows Kaji's time as a private in the Japanese army, but now the bulk of the action, especially in the first half, is confined indoors to the cramped, grim interiors of the barracks. Even though the first installment is the one set in a literal prison, it's the second installment that feels like Kaji is trapped in prison. Something as simple and subtle as overwhelming you with daylight vistas and then withholding that scenery turns the locations of the human condition into something more than mere setting. They externalize Kaji's perspective. When he's full of hope and optimism and trying to do good, he's surrounded by sweeping plains and fresh air. But after his optimism is crushed and he's forced into conscription, his surroundings become oppressive and suffocating. This kind of subtle visual symbolism adds yet another layer of subtext while never feeling short of being perfectly natural and fitting for the story being told. Kobayashi never has to justify or draw attention to his directorial choices. He lets the story and characters always take 100% priority. In other words, his directorial choices never feel indulgent, artificial, or superfluous in the way that many other directors come off. By the way, if you're a big fan of Full Metal Jacket, watching The Human Condition 2 is likely to give you déjà vu. Even though Full Metal Jacket was adapted from a book, the best parts of Kubrick's film were all lifted from The Human Condition 2, The Road to Eternity. It's almost a remake for the first half, except this film has a lot of other things going on simultaneously. Kaji's pacifism shines particularly bright in the second installment, especially once he is eventually put in charge of training a group of new recruits. The old veterans and the higher-ups all hate his guts and beat Kaji mercilessly, trying to goad him into fighting back, but he never does, not physically anyway. The beatings affect him, they wear him down, but they don't break his resolve. Not only is this an effective display of the potential of pacifism, but it's also a perfect antidote to the foibles of amped-up bravado and an imposed need to project one's masculinity, as we're so often fed in other war films. By telegraphing perceived weakness in the eyes of those who beat him, Kaji truthfully radiates tremendous strength. So what I'm saying is Kaji is a goddamn role model. I swear if middle schoolers were obsessed with Kaji instead of, Andrew Tate or whoever the new model of that toxic masculinity disguised as a male role model is, then this upcoming generation of young men would have such a better starting point. They say the perfect man doesn't exist, but then there's Kaji. This dude would be ideal husband material if he wasn't already married and also dead and also fictional. Hang on, how did we get on that? Let's get back on topic. In this single shot, all of Kaji's strengths and the entire point of his ceaseless pacifism are made crystal clear. Kaji has never insulted, struck, or belittled the men under his purview, all of which are the standard disciplinary measures followed by every single other person in his position and higher. But all of the brutal torment that's the norm leads to results like this. While Kaji leading by example and through caring and understanding produces results like this. Even while telling his men that their real enemy is their army itself. One of the most common pieces of writing advice is to show rather than tell, and this is showing rather than telling in the purest sense. The film could be on the nose and state its message bluntly, but instead it crystallizes that message and delivers it with a simple shot and use of contrast that speaks volumes. By the time you get to the trilogy's third installment, Kaji's situation has again been exacerbated. It's a case of desperate times calling for desperate measures, as now instead of serving as a bureaucrat in a prison camp or a training officer in the barracks, he's on the front lines fighting in the war itself. Kaji tries with all his might to remain true to his morals, but instead he faces a slow corruption of the soul from the pressures of his circumstances. This quote from Volume 3 sums it up well. The fact that socialism is better than fascism isn't enough to keep us alive. Kaji's situation is life or death, and he's forced to reconcile his will to live with the morals that he knows to be virtuous. And since we've already spent so many hours with Kaji, every decision and every moment of contemplation holds tremendous weight. There's so much more I could say, but I'm trying to avoid spoilers, which becomes increasingly difficult when talking about the later films in the trilogy, so I think I'll leave the rest for you to discover on your own. Clear an entire day and watch the full trilogy in one sitting, or parcel them out one at a time over an extended period of time. Either approach works. The important part is that you watch the Human Condition trilogy. Thanks for watching. You can check out the rest of my Essential Cinema playlist on screen, or check out my Top 250 Films of All Time video, where this trilogy took the #1 spot. And if you want to support the channel, check out that Patreon link. You get bonus videos and early videos on a regular basis.